Last Saturday night, American media outlets had a big news story breaking in Baltimore, Maryland. Protests over the death of yet another African American at the hands of the police had turned violent. However, coverage on major news networks, CNN, along with Fox and MSNBC, was scant. The majority of those networks had their cameras trained on an event that was only 50 miles away, the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner, a black tie affair where journalists and the politicians that they're supposed to cover were rubbing shoulders and clinking glasses. The local news media in Baltimore were on the story, and by the time the national media showed up, they were greeted with the same kind of resentment that they faced in Ferguson, Missouri last year, as well as complaints that they were more interested in the destruction of property than in the deprivation and the disillusionment that fueled the unrest. No news organization wants to be late to a story. Sometimes it happens, and there's nobody to blame. But that wasn't the case last weekend, and a more vivid example of the disconnect between journalism in the American mainstream news media and the citizens they are supposed to cover and inform would be difficult to find. Our starting point this week is not Washington, it's the streets of Baltimore.
When I've talked to people as a journalist, the main thing that I'm hearing is not so much anger at the media or at myself. It's really just, please get it right.
What do we want?
Justice! Frustration is really with their way that they're perceived by everyone, their way that they're perceived by police officers, their way that they're perceived by judges, their way that they're perceived by journalists. They really want to make sure that they're seen as human beings.
Riots, as Martin Luther King said, are the voice of the unheard. What happened in Baltimore, Maryland on Saturday, April 25th, was the story of the unseen. The first few days of protests after Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old, died in police custody were peaceful, and there was some national news coverage. The details of his death, the coma, the broken spine, the 6 officers suspended, made for familiar reading. But when Saturday came and the violence erupted, the story went to another level. Although you would not have known that by watching CNN or the other mainstream news networks. Their plan that night was to cover the White House Correspondents' Dinner, just down the road in D.C. And for the most part, they stuck to it.
Can you believe that I'm here with Jane Fonda?
So the White House Correspondents' Dinner is kind of this nerd prom where you have all of the U.S.-based journalists come together.
Good evening, everybody.
And they have this dinner, and the president speaks, and other people speak, and it's kind of like a roasting event.
It's really a weird sort of nexus where you're bringing journalists who are supposed to be antagonistic and supposed to be holding political figures accountable, when you're bringing them all together for yucks and for laughs.
All mainstream media covers it, and unfortunately, the day that the White House Correspondents' Dinner was going on, there was also some serious stuff happening in Baltimore, the town next to it.
And the fact that CNN decided to stay on the White House Correspondents' Dinner and to focus on people laughing and the president telling jokes speaks volumes about the state of the news media in this country.
Welcome to the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the night when Washington celebrates itself.
What it tells us about the relationship between big media and politics, I think, is that there's also time for a time out. Some people are uncomfortable by it. Sometimes I am, because sometimes it's too cozy. But I still would argue that it's important for those who are covering and being covered to have an opportunity to get to know one another and just kick back.
The Correspondents' Dinner is a Washington institution that has only recently faced the scrutiny it has long deserved. Most of the Beltway media still consider it a can't-miss event, but the New York Times, for one, no longer attends. One of its columnists wrote in 2007 that the coziness on display is a crystallization of the press's failures in the post-9/11 era, given that it illustrates how easily a propaganda-driven White House can enlist the Washington news media. And when it comes to live coverage, the news networks find the blend of political power and celebrity on display irresistible, even when there's real news happening.
I don't blame CNN for covering the White House and the president's jokes. Where the criticism comes in is when they don't switch over to the coverage of what's actually happening in our communities, where there is obviously some serious tension, violence, racial tension, police brutality. And so my concern there is that they're going to cover celebrity culture through the lens of politics instead of covering what's happening in the streets, sans the celebrity culture, sans the glitz and glamour.
The fact of the matter is that many things can happen at once. CNN is often criticized for covering one story at a time. In this particular case, CNN and other networks have spent days and hours covering Baltimore, hearing from the residents and others. So I don't think that CNN or any cable news organization should be judged on the second-by-second coverage that it puts together. They need to be judged on the overall totality and diversity of points of view that they bring to the story.
And then when CNN did decide to cover the Baltimore uprising, they covered it in the most sensationalist way, focusing on the violence.
They're going in there stealing whatever the hell they want to steal in there.
If you listen to the coverage that you may find on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or even the local coverage in Baltimore, it's clear that the media is not on their side. Criticizing the protesters, questioning what they're doing, placing broken property over broken lives, and in Freddie Gray's case, a broken spine, speaks to why the people are lashing out and responding at the news media.
My question to you is, when we were out here protesting all last week for 6 days straight peacefully, there were no news cameras, there were no helicopters, there was no riot gear.
When the national media got back to Baltimore, they arrived in big numbers, and some got a hostile reception.
I want you and Fox News to get out of Baltimore City. You weren't here, but you're here for the black riots that happened. You're not here for the death of Freddie Gray.
Amateur media critics in the streets were in no mood to have their story told in terms of the effect, the violence and destruction, without an examination of the social context, what they see as the cause.
Easier to consume the spectacle because it is something that we can wrap into a nice soundbite. It is something that we can wrap into a short 3-minute video that then will be posted online and shared across the nation and across the globe. So I get it, it's easy to do that. Is it necessarily a responsible thing to do as a media organization, as a corporation? No, it's not. At a systemic level, it is a problem, but we have an ethical responsibility to report on what's happening outside of that spectacle.
People here really want to make sure that their story is correctly recorded. So I think they've really been asking journalists to really listen to them, to try to let them say, this is my neighborhood, this is why looting happens. While we don't condone looting and we don't want it to happen in our neighborhood, here's the reason why things are happening. So I think they really want a more complex view.
These newsrooms, dominated by white people, don't have an understanding about the issues and the situation in which black people, particularly poor black people in this country, live. You cannot count on the American media to do that for us. They would much rather rub elbows in Washington, D.C. than do their damn job and get out and cover the police oppression and the socioeconomic terror to which poor people, not just black people, but disproportionately black people, but people all across this country are subjected to.
Baltimore's is a complex, multi-layered story beyond the demographics and understanding of many American newsrooms. As for the obsession with the annual shindig in D.C., the news networks made that call for reasons that are largely commercial. Celebrity sells and attracts ratings in a way that social injustice simply does not. And the fact that the biggest African-American celebrity of them all distracted the networks that night will be of no consolation to the people on the streets of Baltimore whose voices went unheard.
On the download this week, our viewers on the way the story has been covered in Baltimore.
The media is literally using black people to disparage other black people. Black commentators must condemn the burning of a CVS or throwing rocks, and often if they are unwilling to do so on their own, they are prompted by reporters until the thrust of the interview becomes about whether or not they are willing to condemn property destruction as violence and validate a reaction to these events that is rooted in whiteness.
The real impact of police violence and police brutality really has not been told by the media, and so consequently, people think that the police kill someone once a week or once every few weeks. We've had days in 2015 already in America where 8 or 9 people are killed in one day by American police, and so Baltimore's paid a heavy price, and the media really has not done a great job covering the wide scope of the issue.